Let me tell you how this started, because the beginning matters, and because if I don't tell it honestly, you'll think this was my idea. It was not my idea. We were sitting at the dining table in our house in San Diego on a Saturday morning in March. I had my laptop open and I was showing Eddie, that's my husband Eduardo, who has gone by Eddie for the 38 years I've known him. I was showing him a listing for a 55-plus community in Carlsbad. Lovely place, Spanish tile roofs, a heated pool, a little fitness center, walking paths with bougainvillea that bloomed year-round. I had bookmarked 4 floor plans and was walking him through the merits of the 2-bedroom with the bonus room that could be a craft space or a home office. And Eddie looked at the screen. Then he looked at me. Then he said in that particular calm voice he uses when he has already decided something and is only now choosing to let me know about it. "Diane, I want to go home." I thought he meant to the grocery store. That's how far behind I was. He did not mean the grocery store. He meant the Philippines. He meant the island of Panay, specifically. He meant the city of Iloilo, where he was born 66 years old ago, where his mother and 3 of his sisters, and what I can only estimate as somewhere between 40 and 60 cousins still lived, and where he had not spent more than 2 weeks at a time in 36 years because we had built our life in California, and that was where our life was. I closed the laptop. I looked at him. I said, very calmly, "Eddie, absolutely not." He smiled, the smile he has been smiling at me for 38 years. The one that means he is not going to argue because he has already won and is simply waiting for me to finish catching up. And he said, "Let's just talk about it." This is the story of what happened after Let's Just Talk About It. I need to give you some background because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Diane. I am 64 years old, born in Bakersfield, California, raised in San Diego from age 7. My father managed a Sears automotive department, and my mother was a woman who believed that keeping a clean house and raising polite children were achievements that deserved more recognition than they received, and she was right about both. I have never lived anywhere except California. Not once. The furthest I have ever moved is 14 miles from the apartment Eddie and I rented when we first got married to the house we bought in Claremont Mesa in 1993. I met Eddie in 1986 at a hospital in San Diego where I was a dental hygienist working in the affiliated clinic, and he was a physical therapist who had arrived from the Philippines 5 years earlier on a work visa. He introduced himself to me in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon by handing me the wrong coffee, realizing it immediately, apologizing in a way that somehow took 4 minutes and included a story about his grandmother, and making me laugh so hard that the receptionist came to check if someone was choking. We were married 7 months later. That is fast. My mother told me it was fast approximately 40 times before the wedding. She was not wrong. She was also not going to stop it. We raised 2 children, our daughter Rachel, who lives in Seattle and has opinions about everything and shares them generously, and our son Kevin, who lives 20 minutes from us in San Diego and whose 2 children, my grandchildren, were the centerpiece of every argument I made for the next 6 months about why we were absolutely not moving to the Philippines. We bought the house in Claremont Mesa in 1993. We paid it off in 2019. We had a life, a real, rooted, complete life. Sunday dinners with Kevin's family, date night every other Friday at the same Thai restaurant where the owner knew our order and still brought menus out of politeness. The yard Eddie had been improving for 30 years with the focused energy of a man who understood soil the way some men understand engines. I had assumed that life would simply continue into retirement the way a highway continues past the county line. Same road, different sign. What I had failed to account for was Eddie's plan, which he had apparently been developing quietly for approximately 4 years, and had chosen a Saturday morning in March to introduce to me alongside his second cup of coffee and a look of absolute calm that I now recognize as strategic. Let me tell you about Eddie's plan as it unfolded over the following 5 months of what he called conversations and I called a siege. He wanted to go home to Iloilo, not for a trip, to live, to be near his mother, Nanay Ising, who was 87 and still running the household with the quiet authority of a woman who had raised 6 children through typhoons and poverty, and a husband who died young and had decided somewhere along the way that she was simply not going to be defeated by anything, including old age. He wanted to be near his sisters. He wanted to be in the place that had made him before California, made him something additional. He talked about it the way people talk about something they have been carrying for a long time and have finally set down in front of you, carefully, with evidence, with the particular patience of a man who knew his wife well enough to understand that she would require data and time, and who was fully prepared to supply both in whatever volume was necessary. I had objections. I had objections organized by category and subcategory. There were the grandchild objections, the strongest ones, the ones that made my voice crack when I said them. Kevin's kids. Ella, who was 6, and Jake, who was 3, and who I was not prepared to watch grow up on a phone screen. There were the medical objections. I had a doctor I trusted and a dermatologist I'd been with for 15 years, and I was 64 years old, not 28, and this was not an adventure. This was our health. There were the cultural objections, and I will tell you about them honestly because this is that kind of story. And if I'm not honest, it's not worth telling. I had never lived anywhere except California. I didn't speak Ilonggo. I didn't understand the food or the bureaucracy or the traffic or any of it. And the prospect of being a foreigner in my own retirement felt, frankly, terrifying. Eddie listened to every objection. He did not dismiss a single one. He said, "Those are fair. Let's go for 3 months, then decide." I said, 3 months is not deciding. 3 months is a long vacation. He said, then it's a vacation. Come on a vacation with me. I knew what he was doing. I went anyway. Because 38 years of marriage teaches you which battles are real and which ones you've already lost and are just performing the resistance for the sake of your dignity. We flew to Iloilo in January. Eddie told me January was the best month because the weather was slightly cooler and the holiday season had wound down enough that his family's energy level would be at a volume I could absorb without my nervous system filing for divorce. I appreciated this consideration and told him so. He accepted it with the composure of a man banking goodwill for later withdrawal. His family met us at the airport. When I say family, I need you to understand what that word means in this context. There were 16 people, 16, holding a banner that said, "Welcome home," Eddie and Diane, in hand-painted letters that reflected deep enthusiasm and no particular commitment to consistent font size. His mother, Nanay Ising, who was 4'10" and 87 years old, and who moved through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been the most important person in every room she'd entered for 6 decades. She went straight to Eddie. She held his face in her 2 small hands and said something in Ilonggo that needed no translation. The sound a mother makes when the child she sent into the world 36 years ago is standing in front of her again. Then she turned to me. She took both of my hands. She looked at me for a long moment with eyes that were doing a very thorough assessment, and she said, in careful English, "You are finally here. You must be hungry. Come." That was my introduction to the Philippines. You must be hungry. Come. It turned out to be the essential sentence of the entire country, repeated in different forms by every person I would meet for the next 3 months. The first week was a lot. I want to be honest about that because if I'm not, the rest of the story doesn't mean anything. Iloilo city traffic operates on a philosophy I have still not fully decoded. It appears to be governed by a combination of optimism, faith, and a collective agreement that lanes are decorative rather than functional. The jeepneys, those brightly painted little buses that are the backbone of transportation here, move through intersections with a confidence that I found initially inspiring and then immediately terrifying. The heat. Eddie's cooler month still made a San Diego August feel like standing next to an open refrigerator. The noise, The roosters, I need to talk about the roosters. There are roosters everywhere, and they operate on a schedule that has no relationship to the sunrise or to any known system of timekeeping. They will announce themselves at 3 in the morning with the conviction of someone delivering critical news. I asked Eddie about the roosters on day 3, and he shrugged and said, "They've always been here," in a tone that suggested I should have been aware of this, as though roosters were something covered in the marriage vows. But the thing I was not prepared for was what happened to Eddie. This is the part of the story that I think matters most and that I didn't see coming. In San Diego, Eddie was quiet. I say this with 38 years of love behind it. He was thoughtful, funny when you knew him, warm with the grandchildren, steady, but contained. There was a particular restraint to him that I had always understood as personality. That's just Eddie. He's the calm one. Here, surrounded by his mother and his sisters and the cousins and the neighbors who had known him since he was a boy running through these same streets. He was a different man, not different, more. He was louder. He laughed with his whole body, this big, open, shoulder-shaking laugh I had heard maybe a handful of times in 38 years. He talked over people and was talked over, and nobody minded because that was how it worked. He sat in his mother's kitchen for hours while they spoke in Ilongo about things I couldn't follow, and he looked like a man who had found a room he'd been locked out of for 3 decades and had just walked back in and sat down and exhaled for the first time. I sat across the table watching him become someone I recognized but had never fully met. And I felt 2 things at exactly the same time: a deep, aching happiness for him, and the specific loneliness of being the only person in the room who doesn't understand what's funny. I want to tell you about the month I nearly made him take me home, not because I'm proud of it, because I think this is the part that matters most, and the part that women like me, women who followed their husbands into something they didn't choose, need to hear told honestly. It was week 4. The novelty had settled into something permanent, which meant I had to start actually living in it instead of observing it. My Ilongo was essentially non-existent. I could say salamat, thank you, and tagpila, how much, and a phrase Eddie had taught me that he claimed meant the food is delicious, but which I later discovered meant something closer to my stomach is full of wind, which explained the very specific laughter I'd been generating at family dinners for a month. The family was wonderful. Every person was warm and welcoming and made real effort to include me. But inclusion, when you don't share a language, has a ceiling. There were long meals where conversation moved around me in Ilongo like a river around a rock. I would eat and smile and nod and understand nothing. Eddie would translate when he remembered. He usually remembered. But sometimes the conversation moved too fast, or he got swept up in it, and I would sit for stretches in a room full of people who loved my husband and were tolerating me with genuine kindness, and I felt the particular loneliness of being surrounded by warmth you cannot quite touch. One afternoon, I excused myself from a family gathering at his sister Ataging's house. I went outside and sat on the concrete wall by the street and called Rachel in Seattle. I said, "Rachel, I don't think I can do this." She asked me what I meant. I said, "Your father is home here. I can see it. He is completely and totally home, and I don't know how to be home in a place that isn't mine. He found himself, and I lost myself, and I don't know what to do with that." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, how long did it take you to feel at home in San Diego after you and Dad got married?" I thought about it. I said, "Honestly, probably 2 years." She said, "You've been there 4 weeks." I did not tell her that this was an extremely irritating observation because it was also completely correct. What changed things was not one moment. It was the accumulation of small things over the following weeks, the way real change always comes. It was Nana Ising teaching me to make chicken tinola in her kitchen. She stood beside me and guided my hands without speaking English because she didn't need to. She communicated in ginger and lemongrass and the particular way she tapped my wrist when I was cutting the green papaya too thick. The first time I made it on my own and brought a pot to her house, she tasted it and looked at me and nodded once. One nod. From a woman who had raised 6 children through decades that would have broken a lesser person. That one nod sat in my chest for a week. It was Manang Lita, a neighbor, an older woman who lived 3 houses down and who had somehow understood without being told that I was drowning. She started appearing at the porch in the mornings with her coffee, at first just sitting near me, not speaking, because she had almost no English and I had almost no Ilonggo. We sat together in the warm morning quiet and communicated the way women have always communicated when words fail. A look, a gesture at something on the street, laughter at the rooster that seemed to have a personal vendetta against the dog next door, a kind of patient presence that didn't require language and was sometimes more honest than language could have been. She never asked me if I was okay, she just showed up. And showing up, it turned out, was the answer to a question I hadn't known how to ask, and it was the fiesta. The barangay fiesta, which arrived about 6 weeks into our stay with the force and inevitability of weather, decorations overnight, a sound system assembled in the street with alarming speed and questionable structural integrity, tables appearing on the road in front of every house, cooking that had been happening for 3 days, releasing smells that traveled entire blocks. Eddie's family had a table, and I was at it. And there was lechon, the roasted pig, skin so crisp it shattered when you cut it. And I tried to describe it to Rachel later and could not because some tastes exist outside of language. There was pancit and sinigang and a dessert called halo halo that is shaved ice and sweet beans and purple yam, ice cream and leche flan and fruit all in one glass and sounds completely insane and is the single best thing I have ever eaten in heat. And there were speeches and songs and dancing that I watched from the edge of things until Eddie's youngest sister, Maricel, grabbed my hand and pulled me in. And I danced badly in the street in the dark with people I mostly didn't know, my shoes off on the warm concrete, someone's speaker playing a song I'd never heard and would never forget. And I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in months, in a way I hadn't laughed in years. And Eddie stood on the side watching me with an expression I recognized from our wedding reception 38 years ago. That was the night I stopped counting the days until we went home. We went home to San Diego in April. 3 months, as agreed. I walked into our house in Claremont Mesa, the one we'd paid off, the one I'd been defending as the correct location for our retirement, and I stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter where I'd had my laptop open in March with the Carlsbad Retirement Community bookmarked, and I felt quietly, completely, without drama, that something inside me had shifted to a position it was not going back from. Eddie didn't say a word. He made coffee. He handed me a cup. He sat down at the table and waited with the patience of a man who has been married to the same woman for 38 years and knows exactly when not to speak. I lasted 5 days. On the 6th morning, I sat down across from him and said, "Show me the real numbers. What does it actually cost?" He had a spreadsheet. Of course he had a spreadsheet. He'd probably had it ready since March. He may have had it ready for 4 years. I chose not to investigate the timeline too closely because I wanted to remain more impressed than annoyed, which is a marital skill I have refined over decades and which I recommend to anyone who plans to stay married past the point where love becomes a decision you make every morning. Here is what we found. A house, not an apartment. A house. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, a quiet neighborhood in Jaro, which is a district of Iloilo, 15 minutes from his family, between 14,000 and 17,000 pesos a month. At current exchange rates, that was between $250 and $300. In San Diego, our property taxes alone on the house we owned free and clear were $7,400 a year. The house itself, if we sold it, would give us a cushion that rewrote the entire math of our retirement. Our combined income, Eddie's pension from 33 years as a physical therapist, my Social Security, reduced because I'd taken it early, and the small amount I'd saved on my own. Together, that came to just over $3,600 a month. In San Diego, that was livable but tight, comfortable if nothing went wrong. In Iloilo, that number was, without exaggeration, more than enough for a life that included a housekeeper, regular family meals that we didn't have to budget for because someone was always cooking, medical care at a fraction of what we'd paid in California, and the ability to actually enjoy our days instead of quietly calculating whether we could afford to. I looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then I looked at Eddie. I said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" He said, very carefully, that he had been doing some preliminary research. I asked him to define preliminary. He admitted it had been roughly 4 years. I said, "Eduardo?" He said, "Yes, dear." I said, 4 years. He smiled the smile. We sold the house in the fall. I will not pretend it was easy. I cried on the last day standing in the empty kitchen the way you cry when you're not sad exactly, but when you understand that a chapter has ended and the binding is closed and you are holding the next volume and it is blank. Eddie stood with me. He didn't say anything. He has been married to me long enough to know that sometimes the right thing is just to be there while the feelings move through. We drove to Kevin's house for a last dinner with the grandchildren. I held Ella for a long time, then I held Jake, and that was harder than the house. That will always be harder than anything else. Kevin walked us to the car, and he looked at me and said, "Mom, you know you can come back whenever you want." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean it, anytime." And I saw on his face that he was trying very hard to be supportive and was also trying very hard not to cry, and I loved him enormously in that moment for both of those things. We landed in Iloilo on a Tuesday afternoon. Nanay Ising was at the airport with Maricel and Ada Ging and 5 cousins and a banner that said simply, "Finally," which was accurate. We have been here 2 years. I want to tell you what it is now, the ordinary shape of it, because the ordinary is the point, and because the ordinary is what nobody tells you about and what actually matters. My Ilongo is no longer a source of comedy at the market. It is still not good. But it has crossed the line from the kind of bad that makes you the joke to the kind of bad that makes you part of the joke, and that difference is everything. Nanay Ising has made me her project in the kitchen. I have learned to make tinola and pancit molo, which is an Iloilo specialty, a pork dumpling soup that Nanay Ising's version of is, according to her, the correct version, and all others are well-intentioned but mistaken. I have learned to make KBL, Karios Baboy Lanka, which is a soup with pigeon peas and pork and jackfruit that is specific to the Western Visayas, and which Nanay Ising has graded my version of as acceptable, which from this woman is the equivalent of a standing ovation. We have a house in Jaro, a real house with a yard where Eddie has already started doing things with the soil that I do not fully understand, but that make him visibly, physically happy. Our housekeeper, a woman named Nenny, has been with Eddie's family in various forms for 14 years and regards my cooking with the diplomatic silence of someone who knows better and is too gracious to say it directly. I have my market days, Tuesdays and Saturdays, where I have my vendors, people who know what I want before I ask, and who greet me by name, and who correct my Ilongo with the warm patience of people who have decided I am theirs to teach. I have a coffee shop near the university where I go Thursday mornings with my book, and where the woman behind the counter, her name is Ate Joy, has my order ready before I reach the register, which is one of the small, specific pleasures that makes a place feel like it belongs to you. And I have Manang Lita, who still comes to the porch most mornings, whose English has slowly improved as my Ilongo has slowly improved, so that our mornings have become gradually more verbal and less purely present, though the presence was always the point. She remains the person I would call first if something went wrong on this side of the world. She is not a replacement for Rachel or for my friends in San Diego. She is something I didn't know existed until she sat down next to me without being asked. A friendship that arrived not because I went looking for it, but because someone paid attention and made room. The hard parts are real, and I will not minimize them. I miss Kevin and the grandchildren with an ache that video calls soften but never solve. Ella lost a tooth last month, and I watched it on a phone screen and smiled and cheered, and then sat on the porch afterward and felt it. The heat is a negotiation, particularly the months before the rains come, when the air becomes something you wear rather than breathe. There are days when the foreignness of everything sharpens to a point, and I am reminded, not unkindly, that I am still learning. The bureaucracy of staying legally in the country as the American spouse of a Filipino requires paperwork that I have chosen to handle with patience and a very competent visa agent rather than with frustration, which would cost more in every way. And there are moments, quiet ones, usually in the evening, when I look at Eddie across the kitchen and understand that this was always his plan. That the Saturday morning with the laptop and the Carlsbad retirement community was never going to end the way I intended. That he had known this with the particular patience of a man who has loved the same woman for 38 years and understands that she will come around if given sufficient evidence and sufficient time. Last month, Rachel came to visit with her husband and their daughter. I watched her step off the plane into the Iloilo heat and make the exact face I had made 2 years ago. The face of a woman recalibrating everything she thought she understood about temperature. I watched her walk through the market on her second morning and stop in front of the fruit stalls the way I had stopped, overwhelmed by the color and the smell and the sheer impossible freshness of everything. On her last evening, we sat on the porch after dinner. Rachel and her husband and Eddie and me and Nene Icing, who had fallen asleep in her chair with the complete and total commitment of the very old and was snoring softly with perfect dignity. And Rachel looked out at the neighborhood in the warm dark, the tricycles, the sound of a television from the house next door, someone's karaoke starting up down the street, as it does every evening, because this country treats karaoke not as entertainment, but as a basic human right. And Rachel said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I asked her what she meant. She said that it was like this. You described it, but you didn't describe it. Why didn't you tell me it was actually like this? I told her I hadn't known how, that some things need to be stood in rather than described. She nodded. She watched the street for a while. Then she said, "Dad was right." I said, "I am aware." I told her not to tell him I'd said so. She laughed. And then more quietly she said, "You seem happy, Mom." Like actually happy? I didn't realize how long it had been since you seemed actually happy. I thought about the Saturday morning in March with the laptop open and the Carlsbad retirement community with the heated pool and the bougainvillea. I thought about the 5 months of objections I had organized by category and subcategory. I thought about week 4 in Iloilo when I had sat on the wall outside Ate Ging's house and called Rachel and told her I didn't think I could do this. And I looked over at Eddie, who was telling Nanay Ising's sleeping form something in Ilonggo that was clearly very funny to him, talking to his 89-year-old sleeping mother the same way he'd been talking to her his whole life, and who looked as he had looked from the first week we arrived here, like a man who had walked back into a room he'd been locked out of for 36 years and finally, fully, completely exhaled. I said, I actually am. Eddie looked over and caught me saying it. He raised his eyebrows. His version of "I told you so," the one he has had the grace not to say out loud in 38 years of practice. I raised mine back. My version of "I know." You don't have to. This is retirement. It is not the 2-bedroom in Carlsbad with the heated pool and the bougainvillea. It is a porch in Iloilo in the warm dark with a sleeping mother-in-law and a husband who has finally fully come home, and a woman from San Diego who came along for what she was told was a 3-month vacation and has not for one single day since wanted to leave. Some plans are better than the ones you made yourself. It just takes a while to admit it. 38 years in, I am still learning that, and I think that's exactly as it should be. If this story sounded familiar, if you're the one with the objections organized by category, or if you're the one with the plan your spouse hasn't told you about yet, or if you're sitting somewhere right now wondering whether the life you built is the same as the life you actually want, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are more stories like this to tell. Real ones, from real people who followed someone they love into something they didn't choose and found out it was exactly what they needed. Leave a comment. Tell me your version. I read every single one, and I've got nothing but time and a porch and a mother-in-law who is probably about to wake up and ask if anyone is hungry.